Hey friends, welcome to this WALi Talk, recorded at the 2024 WALi Summit. To learn more about our annual conference, the WALi Summit, click up here. It's for all those who plan and lead worship. You are about to hear from Reverend Dr. David Schmitt, who holds the Greg H. Bennett Memorial Endowed Chair of Homiletics and Literature at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, where he teaches homiletics, which is preaching, and literature. Besides his contributions as an educator, he's also an incredibly valuable resource for the church at large. You can check him out at his podcast, Lectionary Kickstart with Peter Nafsker, or you can find him around the country leading workshops and doing plenary sessions like the one here from the WALi Summit. His topic today, which you're about to hear, is about experiences of beauty and reflecting on those experiences through the lens of the Creed. Here's my teacher, Dr. David Schmitt. I hope you enjoy.
It's been wonderful to be with you. This is my first time at a WALi event, and what I'm realizing is how many different artists, whether you're a musician, a songwriter, a worship leader, pastor, how many different artists are surrounding us in this place. And so I would like to speak about two things. One would be experiences of beauty, and the other would be how we think about experiences of beauty. You know, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, asks the Philippians to keep their eyes open, to look out for skopeo, to look out for examples, people who follow his example. And later in the letter, he asks them to open their eyes even wider. And he says, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is good, whatever is beautiful, think about these things. So what is an experience of beauty, and how do we think about it? Literary scholars have recently devoted themselves to neuroaesthetics. Neuroaesthetics is a discipline that uses the neurosciences to study aesthetic experience. And it makes sense that literary scholars would do this. I mean, after all, you read a poem and you think it's beautiful. Well, what's going on with that? Emily Dickinson, you know, once wrote that when she reads a poem and she feels like the top of her head has been blown off, she knows she has poetry. And now literary scholars are not just taking your head off, but they're looking inside to see what's going on. So I'd like to introduce you to the research of Gabrielle Starr. She was a professor of English at the New York University, and she teamed up with a researcher by the name of Edward Vessel, who was a researcher at the New York University Center for Brain Research. And they decided that they wanted to study what happens in the brain when you have an experience of beauty. Now, they were positioning their study on this fault line in discussions of aesthetics, and the fault line is between an objective and a subjective understanding of beauty. Is there an objective understanding of beauty? Can we come up with laws and qualities that would define what beauty is so that we know what is beautiful for all people in all time? Or is beauty just in the eye of the beholder, so that different objects at different times for different peoples and different places and cultures appear beautiful? They wanted to know what was happening when you saw an external object of beauty. So what they did was they took subjects and they put them in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, which would measure blood flows in the brain, and they showed them pictures of art, nothing that was famous and well-known, but they chose art from all times and places. They had art ranging from the 12th century to the 21st century, Eastern examples, Western examples, representational art and graphic art and expressionism and abstract art. So they had all sorts of art that they would show to people, and the people, when they were in the scanner, would register whether they saw it as beautiful or not. Now, what they discovered was that no one piece of art was beautiful to everybody all the time. Rather, every single piece of art was beautiful to at least one person when it was not beautiful to others. So they found no law that could track external objects as being beautiful or not. But here's the surprising thing. Although there was great variation externally on what was beautiful, there was not great variation internally on what happened to people when they saw something beautiful. In fact, everyone who observed something as beautiful, the same thing happened in their brain. Objects of beauty tapped into or activated the default mode network in the brain. The default mode network is this region of the brain that is suppressed when we are engaged in an external activity. So you're cooking or you're mowing the grass, and the default mode network is suppressed so that you can focus on that external activity. When the default mode network is activated, you begin to focus on an internal activity rather than the external. So you're mowing the grass, and while you're mowing the grass, you're thinking of your son, and you're thinking of what's going on with him at college lately and how he's had a few issues with drugs and alcohol and this fraternity he's joining. And all of a sudden, you're not cutting the grass anymore. I mean, physically you're cutting the grass, but that's not the world you're living in. You feel like you have been transported into another world because the default mode network has been activated, and then suddenly you wake up and you've cut half the lawn and you didn't even know it. The default mode network activates and causes this feeling of daydreaming and being taken out of a temporal experience. Not only does the default mode network create these moments of being transported, but it also creates moments that are very personal. This is the source of identity. It's the place where we gather our memories and we string them together in writing our autobiography. It's a place where we forecast the future, where we process emotions, where we think about characters and people and events. So the default mode network transports us, it's personal, and it's also transformative. The neural networks that are built in these moments of reflection can actually change your life, which may be why the Apostle Paul is so cavalier when he says, whatever is beautiful, whatever is beautiful, think about such things. Why? Because beauty can change your life. That's what an experience of beauty looks like theoretically. What does it feel like practically? Years ago, when I was a student at the Washington University in St. Louis, I was walking along Delmore Boulevard, and I was going to meet other students for a drink. And as I was walking along the boulevard, I came by a Walgreens, and the door shot open, and this old guy, hunched over, wearing this tattered tweed coat, came stumbling out of the door and almost hit me, right? And I thought he was drunk, and so I veered over to the side, and I missed hitting him, but he hit me, not with his body, but with his smell. I expected mothballs and whiskey. What I got was a face full of Old Spice. I would have liked mothballs and whiskey, right? So, you know how you say that everything is beautiful at a time, right? So Old Spice is not something that I would have thought of as beautiful, but in that moment, it was beautiful to me. When I was a kid, I used to hate Old Spice. My dad used it all the time, and I was constantly trying to get him to buy something else. I would give him Christmas gifts and birthday gifts of the finest colognes. At that time, it was Ralph Lauren Polo and Halston. I'd give him these colognes, and he'd put them on the windowsill in the bathroom so that they baked in the sun. And then he'd call me in and he'd say, look at the stuff you bought me. He'd spray it. He says, it doesn't even smell right. I'm like, no, you baked all the aromatics out of it. Of course it stinks, you know. And then he'd reach for his bottle of Old Spice. And he'd put that on. He'd say, see, this still smells the same. And I'd be like, yeah, Dad, you could take that Old Spice, put it in the fiery furnace with the 3 men, pull it out, slap it on a cow, and it would smell the same. But Old Spice, not my favorite. But in that moment, it was beautiful. You see, my dad had died. It'd been about 5 years. I'd finally reached that point where I didn't think of him every day. And I'm walking along, and I'm hit with the smell of Old Spice. And I was transported off of Delmore Boulevard to this little house in Normandy, where I would go to the back bedroom, and my dad was shaving, and I wanted to get there just in time when he put that Old Spice on. And he'd look at me, and he'd say, you want some of it too? And he'd smack it on my face. And the sting and the smell let me know I was seen and I was loved. I had that memory of my father, and when I came to, I had walked past Blueberry Hill, the restaurant where I was supposed to be. Walked past it. I needed to retrace my steps, but I was different because that day I had an experience of beauty that brought me closer to my dad. So that's the experience of beauty. Now, how do we think about such things? What I'd like to do is I'd like to use the creed as a possible way for Christians to think about experiences of beauty. I'm not saying you have to use it, but if you got to go somewhere, what happens if we use the creed, the way the church has confessed God through the centuries? What if we use that as a way of thinking about beauty? If you do, you're going to have 3 types of beauty. And so I'd like to walk through those types of beauty and explain the dynamics that are present. First type of beauty is created beauty. Created beauty is the beauty that God gives us to see. First article beauty, woven throughout his creation, beauty to be seen and to be enjoyed. In the book of Genesis, when Moses writes about the creation of the world, God basically does 2 things, right? He speaks and he sees. He speaks and brings things into being, and then he sees them and enjoys them because they're good. As Lutherans, we have spent a lot of time developing a theology of the Word, a theology of God speaking. God speaks and it happens. He says, let there be, and it is. God's word is an act. It is a performance. It's something that he does. We celebrate this in our theology. We sing it in our hymns. Thy strong word did cleave the darkness, and rightly so, because by God's speaking, we are justified. By God's speaking, water is turned into baptismal waters of life. By God's speaking, we are made his children, and we know that we are loved. It is right and good for us to have a full theology of God speaking. But I often wonder what would happen if we put that much energy into developing a theology of God seeing. Seeing that something is good. 7 times in the creation account, God sees. Each time God sees and it is good. And then the seventh time, there's a little bit of a difference. The 7th time we are told that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Behold. That word that calls for the reader to look. Behold, it was very good. The 7th time God invites us to look with him at what he has made and see that it is good. Now, Moses knew that he was writing this to people who had fallen. He knew that he was writing this to people who were rebellious, people who now lived in a world that was cursed. But he still called us to see. Only as we look at creation, we see the goodness of creation, but we see the curse of its decay. The writer to Ecclesiastes says, everything is beautiful in its time. Everything is beautiful, but only in its time, because it will decay. So when you work with created beauty, there's always going to be this tension between the goodness of God's creation and the curse of decay. When I'm thinking about my father, and I'm walking along, I have awe at the goodness of my Father's work in my life, and yet there is this ache that comes with decay. So when we think about created beauty, you're always going to have this tension between the goodness of creation and the ache that comes with its decay. And sometimes we can overemphasize the goodness of creation. If we overemphasize the goodness of creation, we end up creating art that is superficial, that is sentimental, that is like the Christian Hallmark Channel, right? It isn't real. And sometimes we can so emphasize the curse of decay that we can't anymore see beauty in the world. Created beauty always positions us in this middle, where we have an aching awe, an awe at the goodness, but an ache at its decay. And what that does is it causes us to value all of life as a gift. Unfortunately, living in a secular world, we look at the world as material that we can use. And it's a mundane world. And in order to have a life that is meaningful, you've got to take this mundane material and make it into something that is refined. And so we refine everything. We've got a better wine, we've got a better car, we've got a better coffee, we've got a better home. Because our job is to make life meaningful, and we take the material of creation and we refine it so that we can finally say, this is good. And we train ourselves to be consumers, constantly being served something good, when what God made us to be, we're creatures who cared for the beauty of creation that was cursed with decay. And so first article beauty awakens us to being creatures who receive life as a gift. I was watching this documentary on forest fires in California. I know I'm kind of sick at times. It was the St. Thomas fire in Ojai, California. Back in 2012, I believe it was, 282,000 acres of land were burned. And as I watched that documentary, near the end, there was this moment that struck me as beautiful. There was this background, a landscape of charred wood. It was black because of the fires. And then there was this paved road of human construction where humans used to live. And out of that charred landscape came this little baby black bear. And it was hobbling along. And at first I thought it was hobbling along because it was a baby. And then I realized that it was hobbling along because its paws were burned. And there was this human holding out a plastic bottle of water for that bear. And that moment was filled with awe at a baby bear, ache at his burned paws, and awe at a human who wanted to care for creation. Have you ever been to the art museum? You know how they have the security posted everywhere? I used to think that's because they thought people were going to steal the art, like you're going to walk out with a Monet on your back, right? It's like, no, that's not what they're there for. They're there to keep you from touching the art, right? You got all the signs, do not touch. You've got ropes cordoning off artwork. You've got painted lines on the floor, this far, no further. And yet what happens is the minute somebody sees something beautiful, what do they want to do? They want to lean in and touch it. They want to point out to the person who's with them, look at this. This is so beautiful. That's how beauty works. God, through beauty, invites us to lean in and touch a creation that is decaying so that we can celebrate life as a gift that is good. Created beauty, the beauty God gives us to see, first article beauty woven throughout the creation. Broken beauty is a beauty that God knows we cannot see. It's second article beauty, woven throughout the story of salvation. In the death of Christ, love and evil met in a way that changed your world. In his death and resurrection, Jesus has reclaimed and renamed every evil, suffering experience so that it is now his. And by the grace of God, in the midst of suffering, there are moments of broken beauty. Broken beauty breaks out in the pages of Scripture. You hear it when people write about the death of Christ, and they speak about that death as a fragrant offering that is delightful to God. Broken beauty is breaking out as Jesus sits on the side of the mountain and he starts calling out those who are poor in spirit, those who are mourning, those who are hungering and thirsting after righteousness, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And he says that these people are blessed. It breaks out in the writing of Paul in the rhetorical brilliance as he offers this beautiful catalog of sufferings and talks about how in the dying of Christ there is life, and this treasure is placed in jars of clay. Broken beauty breaks out in the pages of Scripture, and it breaks out in our world. As we now have artwork that shows us glorious pictures of ghastly crucifixions, and we have music that sings about the slaughter of the innocents and a sacred head now wounded. Broken beauty is the stuff of Lutheran theology, knowing that God is present in the midst of suffering. In 1960, Flannery O'Connor received a letter and a photo from a group of nuns. The photograph was of a little girl, Marianne Long. And Flannery O'Connor looked at the photograph and she put it away, but it wasn't exactly the kind of photo you could put away, because it was a picture of broken beauty. Marianne Long had been born and developed a cancer on her right eye, and at the age of 3, her parents gave her to the nuns, and the nuns cared for her until the age 12 when she died. And the photograph was of her first communion. And there in the first communion, you saw her body clothed in a white dress, and you saw her eye bandaged in a white bandage. Broken beauty in a little girl. Now, the nuns had sent this photo and letter to Flannery O'Connor because they wanted her to write a story of Marianne. And Flannery O'Connor refused, but in her refusal, she laid out for us the dynamics of broken beauty. Flannery O'Connor recognized that broken beauty was divided between the evil that is real and that we see in the world, and the love of God that is real but hidden from sight. That all broken beauty is there in that tension of a love that we cannot see in the midst of an evil that we very much see. And O'Connor argues that you have people who emphasize the evil so much that they talk about the ignorance when it comes to speaking about God. And people who emphasize God's love so much that they have an arrogance when it comes to talking about evil. Now, the way she divided it was between atheism and the church. And she said atheists are going to take a child's death and they're going to use it to shut down and silence any talk of God. How could God be present in a child's death, a suffering and death? And that when we're faced with the reality of evil, we have to be silent because we are ignorant of anything that God could do. And then O'Connor said, and the problem is that the church is the exact opposite. She said the church is taking this love of God that no one can see, And they're saying that they can explain everything about the evil. They'll sentimentalize it, they'll erase it, they'll romanticize it, they'll try to talk about how they know exactly what God is doing in the midst of all of this evil. And she said, really, when you're faced with broken beauty, you have to speak with a blind, unsentimental, prophetic eye. Blind because you cannot see the love of God. But it's there. Unsentimental because you have to talk about evil that is there. And prophetic because you're going to prophesy about the certainty of Christ's presence in the midst of such evil. Yesterday, I talked in the sermon about Eleanor Dickinson and the paintings of crucifixions that she did of the people that she talked to who were suffering, and she took their lives, their unheroic lives, and painted them in crucifixions on a heroic scale. That would be an example for you of broken beauty. So we have created beauty, the beauty that God gives us to see. First article, beauty woven throughout creation for us to see and enjoy. We have broken beauty, the beauty that God knows we cannot see. Second article, beauty, woven in the midst of suffering and the stories of salvation. Now, for the third, we have promised beauty. The beauty that God knows we will see. Beauty that is placed into the Christian imagination when God speaks his promises of a new creation. Promised beauty. I remember one Saturday, I was sitting in the parking lot at my church in my car. We were getting ready to go to a social ministry event. And I was paging through all of these calendars from a funeral home, a local funeral home, Hornburg Klein. I had that morning, I'd had a funeral planning workshop, and Hornburg Klein had gladly hosted it, obviously because they wanted some business. And I was happy with the funeral planning workshop because it would give me some idea of what verses people might want to have at their funeral. So it was a perfect match. So I had all these calendars. They were liturgical calendars, you know, they had the liturgical dates and colors on the calendar. And at the top of the calendar, they had a picture of the funeral home, Hornburg Klein, with a telephone number. So every morning when you wake up, you know the liturgical date and you're reminded that you're going to die. Who wouldn't want a calendar like that, right? So obviously I had a lot of them. So I was waiting for people to come. The first person came, Jan, and she had not gone to the funeral planning workshop, and I knew she wouldn't. She really didn't like that kind of stuff. And so I gave her a calendar, and I said, Jan, we missed you this morning at the funeral planning workshop. And I gave her the calendar. I thought she would have known I was joking, but she didn't. She took me seriously, and she took the calendar and tucked it under her arm, and she said, oh, Pastor, she said, I just don't have enough time to do 2 events on a Saturday. And I'm like, Jan, I'm joking. I know you don't really want to go to a funeral planning workshop. And she looks at me, and then she smiled, and she said, you're right, Pastor. She said, you're right. She said, I don't want to plan my funeral. She said, but I would like to plan my resurrection. She said, if you ever have a workshop on that, let me know. And I thought to myself, a workshop on planning your resurrection. Isn't that what worship is? Worship is our workshop on planning our resurrection. Have you ever noticed how God tends to speak into moments of human diminishment and proclaim a promise of future flourishing? God tends to enter into moments of human diminishment and give us a promise of future flourishing. There's this now, not yet dynamic that is happening in the background when you're dealing with promised beauty. You have now a moment of human diminishment, but you have the not yet of this promise of divine flourishing. God is taking Israel through the wilderness and constantly telling them about this promised land that's flowing with milk and honey, human diminishment and a promise of flourishing. Israel goes into exile, and God sends the prophet Isaiah to speak these words of this feast that will be held on this mountain. It'll be the finest of feasts with the finest of meats and the finest of wines, and death will be swallowed up forever, a promise of future flourishing in the midst of human diminishment. Right? So we have this tension of moments of human diminishment and a promise of divine flourishing. And sometimes we can hold so tightly to the moments of human diminishment that we begin to respond out of fear. Fear that we won't have enough. Fear that we're never going to make it. Think about the Israelites, right? Wandering through the wilderness. They've got this promise of a future land flowing with milk and honey. And yet, when they are fed manna, what do? They hoard it. They are supposed to take for one day, but instead of taking for one day, they hoard more than enough and they hide it in their tents. They hoard and they hide when they're facing human diminishment. Remember back in the pandemic when everybody was hoarding and hiding toilet paper? I mean, it's like built into our system somehow that when we emphasize human diminishment, we take and we hoard and we hide, and that is an action of fear. And on the other hand, you have people who are going to overemphasize the promise of divine flourishing, and they're going to act in a foolish way as they try to bring that divine flourishing into the world today. They're going to try to establish God's kingdom by their grand plans of restoration and peace and justice for the entire world, right? And so Israel, when they have this promise of the future land that's flowing with milk and honey, and they come to the edge of the land, they see the inhabitants, they get afraid, and then all of a sudden they decide, no, we're going to do this. We're going to go in and we're going to take that promised land. We have that promise from God, and they try to seize it on their own, and it fails, right? It fails. We can act in foolishness by emphasizing the flourishing, or act in fear by emphasizing the diminishment. And where we should be is right in the middle, where we have small gestures of courageous hope. We know that we are stuck in human diminishment, and there's little we can do to bring about this glorious future. But we do what we can, and it's a small act of courageous hope. It always has puzzled me how Isaiah, when he talks, and Amos, when they talk, when the prophets talk about acts of justice in this world, small things like not using the incorrect weights on the scale, not selling the poor for a pair of sandals. When they talk about small things, they use grand beauty to describe those acts, that this is like justice rolling down the mountains and an overflowing stream as a desert suddenly blossoms because of small acts of courageous hope. You have Stephen, right, being stoned, suffering, human diminishment, and the heavens open, and he sees this divine flourishing as he sees a vision of Jesus, and then he is led to pray for the forgiveness of the people who are killing him. It's a futile gesture, but it's a gesture of courageous hope. And these gestures of courageous hope, they break out in the public realm, and they break out in the private realm. I'm thinking back to those times of rioting in our cities after the shooting of Michael Brown. And you would watch the television and you'd see these images of cars burning, cities being torn apart, a police presence surrounding an area, people rioting, and yet in the background, every once in a while, you'd see on a boarded up shop window, you'd see a piece of graffiti, a piece of art, a larger than life face of someone who has been killed. There's this park in Annapolis, Maryland, where they painted the basketball court, 7,000 square feet of paint. And when you're standing on that basketball court, you really can't see what this paint is doing. But if you fly above the court, if you take a God's eye view, you have the portrait of Breonna Taylor looking up to the heavens. Small gestures of courageous hope, asking us to stop and see in the midst of a part of the city we would rather drive around than drive through. See people who live in the city, people who are not pawns in some anarchist desire to overthrow things, people who are not pawns in some politician's desire to get votes, but people whose lives matter to God and to us. So we start rearranging the seats at our table to welcome in this future that God is bringing. That's a public action of courageous hope. It happens privately too. It can be as simple as a bouquet of flowers that you bring to someone's bedside. There was a woman in my congregation today, but back then we would have called her a bag lady. Today, I guess we would call her a person without a home or shelter. Her name was Ruth, and she came to everything at church, and she was wonderful. She was wonderful. I would often walk her home. There was an apartment complex, a big apartment complex down the hill, that there was a janitor there, or a maintenance person there, who had a closet that had a wash tub and a cot, and he'd let her sleep there if she wasn't sleeping in a shelter. And she would often get her food from the shelters or attend our church potlucks, things like that. And whenever I walked her home, we would take this meandering route, because she would always know what was blooming in people's yards, and she loved flowers. And she would take me by, let's go this way, and we go by Judy Peters because, something was blossoming in her yard, and she just loved flowers so much. Well, Ruth is a person who had nothing, right? And then she had cancer. We had trouble taking care of her with her cancer because she didn't want to stay in a parishioner's home. And for hospice care, you needed to have 24-hour presence with her. So we found a bed for her in a public aid bed in a hospital down in Oak Forest. And one time I was going to visit her. Well, our church had a really difficult ministry with her, trying to help her. He had a lot of parishioners who wanted to do things to help, and one of them, Joanne, she would bring reading material to Ruth. But Joanne loved reading these Harlequin romances, And it's got this photo of a guy with, no shirt on, and Gentle Savage, I think was the name of one of them, And so I'd go in there, and I'd go to Ruth, and she'd say, well, Joanne came over, and I'm like, yeah, and she'd say, she gave me this book. It's pornography. She's like, Pastor, take it away. So, Joanne's bringing her pornography. I'm taking the pornography away. I still remember the one time I had my collar on, and I've got this book, Gentle Savage, and I've got my communion kit and my Bible in this book, Gentle Savage. And I'm going to the desk to talk to the nurse, and Latrice is there. I loved Latrice. And she looks at me with my collar, and she looks at my Gentle Savage book, and she says, finally, a church I can go to. Which was great. So one time I was visiting Ruth, and I had a Ladies Guild luncheon before that, and so we were in the kitchen, and we're putting stuff in the fridge, and at the bottom of the fridge were the flowers from Sunday. In our congregation, people bought flowers, and then they'd take them home. But every once in a while, somebody wouldn't take the flowers home, and then they'd sit in the fridge until they rotted, because nobody would throw them out, and it smelled. So there was this thing of flowers down there, and most of them were dead, but there were a few live ones. And so I decided I was going to pick out of those flowers the ones that weren't dead yet and put them in a vase for Ruth. And it kills me to this day to think that I did that. Because she loved flowers so much, and why couldn't I just go get a bouquet, right? But instead, I'm bringing our used flowers that we should throw away. I'm bringing them to a person who is homeless and dying. It's just crazy. I take them into her hospital room, and the minute she sees them, she's transported. She just looks at them, and she's like, beautiful, so beautiful, so beautiful. She just says it several times. And then all of a sudden, she looks at me, and she says, Pastor, are there going to be flowers in heaven? Now, at this moment, I remembered something I was taught at seminary, and it wasn't helpful. So I'm just so anyway, it was Dean Hempelman who taught us, if a child, their dog dies and they want to know, is there going to be dogs in heaven? He's like, well, the way you answer that is you tell them, well, in heaven, you're going to be in the presence of Jesus. You're going to have eternal joy. And it's kind of a shaming answer. And if in the presence of Jesus, in order to be happy, you have to have your dog, well, then I'm sure dogs will be in heaven. So this is what I remember. So this is what I've got to play with, right? So not only am I giving her used flowers, I'm giving her bad advice. So I look at Ruth, and I said to her, I tried this out. I'm like, Ruth, I said, in heaven, we're going to be in the presence of Jesus. It's going to be beautiful. It's perfect happiness. And I said, and if you need to have flowers there'll be flowers there. And she gave me this look, and she said, oh, Pastor, like I had sinned against her. She said, oh, Pastor. She said, I don't want flowers for myself. I just thought it'd be nice to pick a bouquet and give it to God. She's in this hospital room where all of the machines and all of the charts and all of the people are planning her dying. And there she is, planning her resurrection. A gesture of courageous hope. So, we have three types of beauty. We have created beauty that God gives us to see. First article beauty woven throughout creation to be seen, to be enjoyed. We have broken beauty, the beauty that God knows we cannot see. Second article beauty woven throughout the story of suffering and salvation. And we have promised beauty, the beauty that God knows we will see. Third article beauty, woven in the Christian imagination by the promises of a new creation. So having thought about experiences of beauty, having thought about ways in which we can meditate on those experiences of beauty, I invite you to rejoice in being the artists that God has called you to be. Thank you.